And so today we're going to jump into the third chapter of Colossians, and we're going to learn about an alternative lifestyle that followers of Jesus are called into as participants in this alternative kingdom. So to recap, Paul has already explained in chapters 1 and 2 that because of the work of Jesus, the church of Colossae should look different to those around them. Remember, the book is set in a part of the world that's governed by Rome, the Roman Empire. Paul himself has not been to this church, but he's writing this encouraging letter to sort of urge these people to pursue Jesus, to go towards Jesus alone. The Son is the image of the invisible God. It's Jesus who will complete you, not a philosophy, not a religious system, and certainly not the Roman Empire. Jesus is enough. And so we come to chapter 3. We're challenged to live a transformed life. In God's kingdom, this is the new country, so to speak, that we are a part of. But as Christians, how transformed are we meant to be? What should that really look like in our lives? How do we know if we're truly living a life that is worthy of God? Today's text hopefully should bring some light on how transformed you should be. So you ready? This is Colossians 3, 1-4. It's up behind me, or you can open your Bibles and read along. It says this: "Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your heart on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you have died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory." This is the second time that Paul has sort of mentioned or sort of spoken out that we have been raised with Christ. The first was in chapter 2 in verse 12 when he speaks of baptism. Really, you've been buried and then you've been raised through faith, raised with him. Why does he repeat himself here? What's going on? Well, really, Paul is trying to draw the Colossian church towards Jesus, of course, to remembering what he's done. But now it goes beyond the theoretical and it impacts the identity of the believer so much that they set their heart and their mind on things above. How is this made possible? Paul explains that transformation is only possible through what theologians have coined this term, a beautiful exchange. This is going to be a little bit dense for just a few moments, so please track along with me. But really, Jesus became a man, right? God in the flesh. He became a man, and yet he remained perfect, blameless, spotless. He knew no sin when he went to the cross. The Father treated him as if he had committed every sin for every person in every generation. In fact, for the whole world. And so as he is on the cross, the Father's treating him as if he has done those things. And here in his perfection, the Father sort of is looking at him, and really in that moment he becomes a ransom for your debt. He becomes a substitute for your sin. He becomes a redeemer for your life. It's there that your sins are placed upon the cross, as it reads in chapter 2. But it doesn't just stop there. Not only is our sin nailed to the cross, now believers are also raised to life by the power of the Spirit in us. And his perfection, his holiness, his wholeness is given to us. So your failings, your brokenness, your dirt is given to him. And in exchange for that, he has given you his perfection, his wholeness and his holiness. Paul's already explained this back in chapter 1. It says this: he has reconciled to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, through what? By his blood shed on the cross. This is the beautiful exchange. This is the heart of the story of Jesus. Isn't that such good news? Is anyone sort of grateful for Jesus this morning that he has done that for you? He's done that for me. In fact, he's done it for the whole world. That's the heart of this story. So what does it mean? It means that you're hidden with Christ. You are hidden with Christ. Your past failings, your past sin, all your attempts at good works and sort of religious righteousness, all of that was nothing good. And that is exchanged and now hidden with Christ because of Jesus in this beautiful exchange. And so when the Father looks at you, he sees Jesus. He sees the cross. The book of Colossians so far is telling us about this alternative story where his kingdom, when it rules and it reigns. But now in chapter 3, Paul doesn't just explain that story again just to repeat himself. No, I need you to hear this. Now Paul ties the identity of the believer to that story. Did you notice it? You are now a main character in this story. You. It says this, you have died, you were buried, you are raised, you set your hearts and minds on Christ above, seated at the right hand, and you will be revealed when he comes again. Did you hear that? There's a death, there's a burial, there's a resurrection, there's an even ascension and a second coming. Who? For you. Like you're part of this story now. That's what Paul's trying to explain here. Paul's not finished. And so we're going to keep reading Colossians 3. It says this in verse 5 to 11. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lusts, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. But now you must also rid yourselves of such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Oh, wow. Paul, chill out a bit, hey? Like this is way intense. So intense. But what's he going on about here? What's he saying? Put to death. What's all that? I think he's just said, you've died. Why does he go on to then say, go continue to put on death, like put it to death? Here we find in these verses really the key to living a transformed life in a community of believers who are participating in this alternative reality. Paul addresses many sins. You can see them up here on the board if you can read that. But really they're broken into two main categories: sexual sin and social sin. The first list consists of these self-gratifying and promiscuous acts that occur outside of a commitment of marriage, particularly. But the most shocking part for me, or perhaps the most maybe challenging part for me when I read this, is not necessarily the actions of sexual immorality here, these impurity, lust, and evil desires, but it's really the way that it finishes with these two words: greed and idolatry. The point that he's trying to make is this: that all sexual immorality comes from a place of selfish greed that has the control and consumption of the other person as its ultimate desire. Greed, idolatry. The good news is Jesus is enough. Jesus has paid the ultimate price. That's why I shared that you are hidden with Christ. And if you need to find freedom and to put to death these sexual sins, today is your day of transformation. I really believe it. May this text be your sign from God. Put it to death today. Secondly, Paul lists social sin. And these are all really tied up in our speech. Anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language, and lying. The room got a little bit quiet before when I was talking about sexual sin. But what about these sins? If a church leader committed sexual sin, wow. If there was an affair, wow, there'd be outrage. But what about when someone is filled with rage? What about anger? What about this gossiping and slandering one another? What are we doing with that? Does anyone care about that? Interestingly, the Greek word for slander here is blasphemia. To bear false witness against someone or to cast a whole community in a negative light is blasphemy. Why? Because it slanders the very people who are made in the image of God. And no matter even if you're a Christian or not, all people, we believe, are made in the image of God. Isn't that right? What about when it's the redeemed people of God? Wow. Why would we be slandering this thing here and these people here? Ultimately, it's blasphemy of God when we're slandering one another. By listing off these sins, Paul's not trying to say that we can't be, emotional. We can't feel like hurt or pain or be angry, in that way. Like he's trying to just say that we cannot allow these social sins to stand in the way of the community that Jesus came to build. And here's the good news again. Jesus is enough for you to be transformed. Jesus is enough. You can find transformation for those social sins today. May that be your sign today. These lists, they're not to be viewed, though, as individualistic lists, as individualistic ways to please God. These are actually meant to be communal, showing us as the church what it looks like to live an alternative lifestyle. Because it says this in chapter 3:11. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, Christ is all and is in all. Sexual sin and social sin both come against that. Jesus has united all people from all races, from all generations, from all upbringings and cultural backgrounds. Jesus has united all through him. And so when you're committing sin individually, those sins are actually affecting us as a congregation, as a church. That's what Paul's trying to say here. This is not an individualistic list of sin. This is a communal list of sin. Your personal affairs, your dealings, even your heart and motives have a direct relation to how we grow as a church. The solution to this is to put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge, in the image of its creator. The picture here is sort of taking off old clothes and putting on new clothes. Paul shows us that as a community, we don't need to just stamp out sexual sin or put tape around people gossiping. Instead, we need to put on the new self. So this is an individual responsibility and it has corporate consequences. It says this in 12-14. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself in compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another. Forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. Now, I'm not sure if you noticed this, but this whole putting off and putting on of clothes, this is exactly what Jesus did. Did you notice that he went to the grave? And when they come to the tomb, what do they find at the grave? They find his grave clothes. Interesting. What about Lazarus when he is resurrected after 4 days of being dead? What does Jesus say? He says, take off those grave clothes and let him go. The picture of sort of being hidden comes to mind, hidden behind maybe a pure cloak of love. So the old nature, the old clothes, they need to be put to death. And now Paul encourages us to clothe ourselves really with the fruit of the Spirit. It's a very similar list to Galatians chapter 6. Even 1 Corinthians 13 comes to mind. But when you put on Christ, this is the beautiful exchange. You are putting on his life, his holiness, his perfection. You're becoming mini Christs in the world, like Christians, anointed ones. We should have a deep compassion for those around you, kindness through deeds, humility, thinking of others before yourself, being gentle and meek, leads to forgiveness. That comes from love, doesn't it? So where in your life right now do you need to put on the new self? Is there a part of your life that people do not see Christ's love in you?